Morning of June 28, 1914, began like any other summer day in the ancient city of Sarajevo. The sun rose slowly over the red-tiled roofs and white stone buildings, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and pink, while the morning mist clung to the Miljacka River like a ghostly blanket. Birds sang their cheerful songs in the trees, completely unaware that this beautiful, peaceful morning would soon become one of the darkest days in all of human history. The streets were already filling with people, men and women dressed in their finest clothes, children waving small flags, all coming out to see something special, something that only happened once in a lifetime. They were gathering to witness the arrival of a very important man, an archduke from the powerful Austro-Hungarian Empire, a man whose name was Franz Ferdinand. But hidden among these happy, innocent faces were young men with dark secrets, young men whose hearts burned with anger and whose pockets held weapons of death. The air was warm and still, carrying the sweet smell of summer flowers mixed with the scent of fresh bread from the bakeries along the narrow streets. Shopkeepers opened their doors and swept their doorsteps, preparing for what they thought would be a day of celebration and good business. Mothers held their small children up on their shoulders so they could see over the crowds. Old men sat on wooden benches, smoking their pipes and talking quietly about the old days. Everything looked normal, everything looked safe, everything looked like a perfect summer morning in a peaceful European city. But beneath this calm surface, something dangerous was stirring, something that would soon explode into violence and change the fate of millions of people around the entire world. In a hotel room not far from the main parade route, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was getting dressed in his military uniform, carefully buttoning each gold button and adjusting his medals until everything was perfect. He was 50 years old, a tall man with a thick mustache and serious eyes, a man who would one day become the emperor of one of the most powerful empires in the world. His wife, Sophie, Duchess of Hohenberg, sat nearby, watching him with loving eyes. She was a beautiful woman with soft brown hair and a gentle smile, and she loved her husband more than anything in the world. They had 3 children waiting for them back home, 3 beautiful children who would never see their parents alive again after this terrible day. Franz Ferdinand looked at himself in the mirror one last time, straightened his collar and smiled at his wife. He had no idea that in just a few hours both of them would be dead, murdered in the street like common criminals, their blood spilled on the cobblestones of this foreign city. Meanwhile, in different parts of the city, 7 young men were preparing themselves for murder. They were members of a secret organization called the Black Hand, a group of Serbian nationalists who wanted to break away from the Austro-Hungarian Empire and create their own independent country. These young men believed they were heroes, freedom fighters who would strike a blow against their oppressors and inspire their people to rise up and fight for their liberty. But they were really just frightened boys playing at being soldiers, boys who had been given bombs and pistols by older men who stayed safely hidden while sending children to do their deadly work. One of these young assassins was named Nedeljko Kabrinovic, a 19-year-old printer's assistant with nervous hands and a weak stomach. Another was Gavrilo Princip, a thin, sickly student who suffered from tuberculosis and believed he would die young anyway, so he had nothing to lose. These boys had practiced their plan over and over, memorizing where they would stand, what they would do, how they would escape or die trying. They swallowed their fear like bitter medicine and told themselves they were doing the right thing, the brave thing, the necessary thing. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, the royal motorcade began its journey through the streets of Sarajevo. There were 6 cars in total, moving slowly so the crowds could see the important visitors clearly. The first car carried the city's mayor and police officials. The second car carried security officers. And the third car, an open-top Graf and stiff touring car painted in royal colors, carried Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his beloved wife Sophie. They sat in the back seat, side by side, waving at the cheering crowds who lined both sides of the street. The Archduke wore his full military dress uniform covered in medals and ribbons, while Sophie wore an elegant white dress with a picture hat decorated with flowers. They looked like characters from a fairy tale, like a prince and princess from a storybook, beautiful and untouchable and immortal. But they were just ordinary humans made of flesh and blood, and bullets would tear through them just as easily as they would tear through anyone else. The crowds cheered and waved as the motorcade passed by, thousands of voices joining together in a roar of celebration. People threw flowers into the street, little girls in white dresses danced and clapped, bands played cheerful music that echoed off the ancient stone buildings. It all looked so joyful, so innocent, so full of life and happiness. But scattered throughout this celebrating crowd were the 7 assassins, each one stationed at a different point along the parade route, each one waiting with weapons hidden under their coats, each one ready to kill or die or both. Their hearts pounded in their chests like drums. Their hands shook with fear and excitement. They watched the motorcade approaching, getting closer and closer, and they knew that the moment of violence was almost here, the moment when everything would change forever. The first assassin was positioned near the Kamerja Bridge, and his name was Muhammad Mehmed Basic, but when the Archduke's car approached, his courage failed him completely. He stood frozen like a statue, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to pull out his bomb or do anything at all except watch the car roll past him while shame burned in his chest. The second assassin was Nedeljko Kabranovic, and he was made of sterner stuff. As the Archduke's car came near to where he stood on the Appel Quay beside the Miljacka River, Kabranovic reached into his coat and pulled out a hand grenade. His fingers found the detonator cap and knocked it hard against a lamppost to activate the 10-second fuse. Then, with all the strength in his young body, he hurled the bomb directly at Franz Ferdinand's car, a small black object spinning through the bright morning air like a bird of death. Time seemed to slow down in that terrible moment. The bomb flew through the air, tumbling end over end, heading straight for the back seat where the Archduke and his wife sat completely unprotected. Franz Ferdinand saw it coming, saw the danger, and with reflexes born of military training, he raised his arm to shield his wife. The bomb hit the folded canvas roof of the car, bounced off with a hollow thud, and fell into the street behind them. For one heartbeat, two heartbeats, nothing happened. Then the bomb exploded with a tremendous bang that echoed through the streets like thunder, a blast of fire and smoke and flying metal that shredded the morning air. The explosion hit the fourth car in the motorcade, wounding several army officers and sending shrapnel flying in all directions. People in the crowd screamed and ran in panic, covering their heads, diving to the ground, trampling each other in their desperate rush to escape. But miraculously, impossibly, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were completely unhurt, not even scratched, saved by pure luck and a poorly thrown bomb. Nedeljko Kabranovic knew immediately that he had failed. He saw the Archduke's car still moving, saw that his target was still alive, and he knew that the police would be coming for him in seconds. Following the plan they had rehearsed, he pulled a small vial of cyanide from his pocket, uncorked it, and swallowed the bitter poison in one gulp. Then he turned and ran to the edge of the Miljacka River and threw himself over the stone wall, hoping to drown before the poison killed him, hoping to escape capture and torture and execution. But fate was cruel to Kabranovic that day. The cyanide was old and had lost its deadly strength, so instead of killing him, it only made him violently sick to his stomach. And the river, which he thought would be deep enough to drown in, was actually shallow at that point, barely reaching his waist. He stumbled in the water, vomiting and choking, while police officers and angry citizens climbed down after him. They grabbed him roughly, dragged him back up to the street, and began beating him with their fists and clubs while he was still too sick to defend himself. His face became a mask of blood and bruises, but they kept hitting him again and again, their rage needing an outlet, needing someone to punish for this terrible attack. The motorcade had stopped in confusion, and all around people were screaming and crying and running in every direction. Some people had been hurt by the bomb blast, and they lay on the ground bleeding and moaning in pain. The smell of gunpowder and smoke filled the air, mixing with the smell of blood and fear. Franz Ferdinand stepped out of his car, remarkably calm despite the chaos all around him, and went to check on the wounded officers in the car behind him. He spoke to them quietly, asking about their injuries, showing the kind of courage and leadership that royal men were supposed to show in times of crisis. But inside, his heart must have been racing, and he must have known that someone had just tried to murder him, that someone in this city wanted him dead badly enough to throw a bomb at him in broad daylight. The mayor of Sarajevo rushed up to the Archduke, his face pale with shock and fear and embarrassment. He began apologizing frantically, saying that this was a terrible mistake, that Sarajevo was really a safe city, that this was just one crazy person who did not represent the good people of Bosnia. Franz Ferdinand listened to these excuses with a cold, hard expression on his face. Then he interrupted the mayor's babbling words with a voice that cut like a knife through the morning air. "Mr. Mayor," he said icily, "I come here on a visit and I get bombs thrown at me. It is outrageous." His anger was righteous and justified, and everyone who heard those words felt the weight of his imperial displeasure. But then something strange happened, something that would seal his fate. Instead of leaving immediately, instead of getting back in his car and returning to safety, Franz Ferdinand made a decision that would cost him his life. Sophie, his dear wife, clutched his arm and begged him quietly to leave this dangerous place. Her voice was soft but urgent, filled with the fear that only a woman who loves her husband can leave here now before something worse happens. She could feel it in her bones, that terrible sense that danger was not finished with them yet, that somewhere in this hostile city, more violence was waiting. But Franz Ferdinand was a proud man, a military man, a man who had been trained since childhood never to show weakness or fear in front of others. He thought that if he ran away now, people would call him a coward. He thought that if he cancelled his visit because of one failed attack, it would look like the terrorists had won. So he made the decision to continue to show everyone that he was not afraid, to prove that the heir to the Habsburg throne could not be intimidated by bomb-throwing children. It was a decision born of pride and duty, and it was the worst decision he ever made. The other assassins, stationed at different points along the original parade route, waited nervously for the motorcade to come to them, but it never arrived. After the bomb attack, the route had been changed for safety reasons, and most of the would-be killers stood in empty streets, their weapons hidden uselessly under their coats, their chance for glory slipping away. One by one they gave up and walked away, disappearing back into the crowds, telling themselves that at least they had tried, that at least Kabranovic had struck a blow even if it had failed to kill the Archduke. But one assassin did not give up so easily. His name was Gavrilo Princip, and he was perhaps the most dedicated and dangerous of all the Black Hand members. He was only 19 years old, a thin, pale boy who looked much younger than his age, with dark eyes that burned with an intensity that frightened people who looked into them too closely. Princip was dying slowly from tuberculosis, a terrible disease that was eating away at his lungs and would kill him within a few years. He often coughed up blood and felt weak and feverish. He knew he did not have long to live anyway, which made him braver than the others, more willing to throw away his life for a cause he believed in. When he heard the explosion from Kabranovic's bomb echoing through the streets, his heart leaped with hope, thinking that the mission had succeeded. But then minutes passed and no news came, and slowly he realized that something had gone wrong. The motorcade did not appear on the street where he was waiting. The crowds did not scatter in panic. The police did not come running with news of the Archduke's death. Gradually, Princip understood that the attack had failed, that Franz Ferdinand was still alive, that the carefully planned assassination had turned into a disaster. A terrible sadness filled his heart, a sense of failure and lost opportunity that weighed on him like a stone. Princip began walking aimlessly through the streets of Sarajevo, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, one hand resting on the cold metal of his pistol. He felt defeated, purposeless, like a soldier who had missed his one chance at glory. He thought about going home, thought about just giving up and trying to forget this whole terrible day. But something inside him refused to quit. Some stubborn, determined part of his soul told him to stay in the area, to keep moving, to wait for fate to give him one more chance. So he wandered the side streets, avoiding the main parade route where police were now swarming everywhere, searching for more attackers. Eventually he found himself on Franz Joseph Street, a narrow side street lined with shops and cafes. He stopped in front of Moritz Schiller's Delicatessen and stood there on the sidewalk, not really knowing why, just standing and waiting as if some invisible force was holding him in that exact spot. Meanwhile, Franz Ferdinand had continued his visit to the city hall, where he gave a short speech and received the official greetings from the local government. But his mind was not on ceremonies and formal words. He was thinking about the wounded officers from the bomb blast, and he told his host that he wanted to visit them in the hospital before leaving Sarajevo. It was a kind and noble gesture, the sort of thing a good leader should do for his men who had been hurt while protecting him. But it meant that the motorcade would have to travel through the city streets again, through the same dangerous neighborhoods where assassins might still be hiding. The local officials tried to plan a new, safer route to the hospital, but there was confusion about which roads to take. The Archduke's driver, a man named Leopold Lojka, was not familiar with the city, and he had not been properly informed about the route change. It was a small mistake, a tiny detail that seemed unimportant at the time, but it was a mistake that would have enormous, terrible consequences. At approximately 10:45 in the morning, the motorcade set out again, driving slowly through the streets toward the hospital. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie sat in the back seat of their open car, still waving to the much smaller crowds who had gathered again to watch them pass. Many people had gone home after the bomb attack, frightened and unwilling to risk their lives just to see a royal visitor. The mood was very different now from the cheerful celebration of an hour earlier. Now there was tension in the air, a sense that something bad could happen at any moment, a feeling of dread that hung over the city like a storm cloud. The motorcade turned onto Appel Quay and began following the river, but then something went terribly wrong. At the junction with Franz Joseph Street, the driver Leopold Lojka became confused. No one had clearly explained to him that he was supposed to continue straight along the river road. So he did what drivers normally did at that intersection. He turned right onto Franz Joseph Street, the same narrow side street where Gavrilo Princip was standing. Governor Podierek, who was riding in the front seat of the Archduke's car, immediately realized the mistake. He shouted at the driver, "Stop! You're going the wrong way. We're supposed to go straight." Leopold Lodgka, startled by the governor's angry voice, quickly pressed the brake pedal to stop the car so he could reverse and get back onto the correct road. The car rolled to a complete stop, the engine idling quietly, sitting there motionless in the middle of Franz Joseph Street, right in front of Moritz Schiller's Delicatessen. And standing on the sidewalk less than 5 feet away from the Archduke's car, was Gavrilo Princip. For one frozen moment, the assassin and his target stared at each other through the morning air. Princip could not believe what he was seeing. It was as if God himself had delivered the Archduke directly into his hands, had given him one more chance when all chances seemed lost. His right hand, which had been resting on the pistol in his pocket, suddenly came alive with purpose. Everything else in the world seemed to disappear. The noise of the street, the other people, the fear in his heart, all of it vanished, and there was only him and the target and the gun. Time slowed down to an agonizing crawl, each second stretching out like an hour. Princip pulled the Browning pistol from his coat pocket, a small weapon that looked almost like a toy in his thin hand. He raised it with a surprisingly steady arm, aiming at the man in the back seat of the car. Franz Ferdinand saw the gun, saw the young man pointing it at him, and his eyes widened with the sudden understanding that death had finally found him. The first shot cracked through the morning air like a whip, sharp and loud and final. The bullet left the gun at tremendous speed, crossed the small distance between the sidewalk and the car in a fraction of a second, and struck Sophie in her lower abdomen. She had been sitting close to her husband, and the angle of the shot meant that the bullet hit her instead of him. She gasped, a short, surprised sound that was almost like a question, and her hand flew to her stomach where a red stain was already beginning to spread across the white fabric of her dress. The pain hit her like a wave, intense and burning and impossible to describe, and she felt her strength draining away as if someone had pulled a plug and her life was flowing out through the hole in her body. She slumped sideways, falling toward her husband, her face turning pale as death began its work. Franz Ferdinand caught his wife in his arms, supporting her weight, not yet understanding what had happened. He thought perhaps she had fainted from the shock and fear of seeing the gun. "Sophie!" he cried out, his voice filled with concern and confusion. "What's wrong? Sophie, speak to me." But then Princip's arm moved slightly, adjusting his aim, and he fired a second shot. This bullet found its intended target, striking Franz Ferdinand in the right side of his neck, tearing through the jugular vein, that large blood vessel that carries blood from the head back to the heart. The Archduke's hand went to his throat, feeling the warm blood that was already beginning to pour out of the wound, pumping out with each beat of his heart. His crisp military collar, so perfectly white just moments ago, turned red in seconds, soaked with blood that nothing could stop. He tried to speak, tried to ask for help, but the words came out gargled and weak, barely more than a whisper. Governor Podierek, sitting in the front seat, spun around and saw the nightmare unfolding behind him. "What happened? Are you hurt?" he shouted, though the answer was terribly obvious. Blood was everywhere now, covering the back seat, dripping onto the floor of the car, staining the royal uniforms and the expensive upholstery. Franz Ferdinand, with the last reserves of his strength, managed to form words through the blood filling his throat. He looked down at his dying wife and said in a voice filled with love and desperation, "Sophie, Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children." His words were a plea, a prayer, a command that he knew could not be obeyed. Sophie's eyes were already becoming glassy and unfocused, the light in them dimming like candles being blown out one by one. She tried to respond, tried to say something back to the husband she loved more than life itself, but no words came. Her lips moved silently, forming shapes that could have been "I love you," or "I'm sorry," or simply his name. Then she was gone, her body going limp in his arms, her spirit leaving this world and traveling to whatever comes after. Franz Ferdinand held her for a few more seconds, feeling her weight become heavier as all the tension left her muscles. He knew she was dead. He could see it in her open, empty eyes, could feel it in the way her body had become like a broken doll, all the life and warmth and love that had made her Sophie now vanished forever. Tears mixed with the blood on his face, and he began to pray quietly, ancient words in Latin that he had learned as a child, prayers for the dying and the dead. His own blood continued to pour from the wound in his neck, a steady crimson stream that his body could not afford to lose. He was bleeding to death, and he knew it, could feel his consciousness beginning to fade, could feel a cold numbness spreading through his body like ice water in his veins. The world around him started to blur and darken at the edges, sounds becoming distant and muffled, as if he were falling down a deep well. His last thoughts were of Sophie and their 3 children who would grow up without parents, and then the darkness swallowed him completely. At approximately 11 a.m. on June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, died in the back seat of a car on a street in Sarajevo, his blood mixing with his wife's blood, 2 lives ended by 2 bullets that would soon end millions more. The street erupted into chaos and screaming. People who had witnessed the shooting were running in all directions, some trying to get away from danger, others rushing toward the car to see if they could help, still others chasing after Gavrilo Princip, who was trying to escape. Princip had fired his 2 shots and then, following the plan, turned the gun toward his own head to take his own life rather than be captured. But before he could pull the trigger again, hands grabbed him from every direction. Men from the crowd, police officers, angry citizens who had just watched their city's guests be murdered in cold blood, they all fell upon the thin young assassin like a pack of wolves. They beat him with fists and sticks, kicked him when he fell down, tore at his clothes and hair. Someone wrestled the gun away from him. Someone else tried to strangle him with their bare hands. Princip felt bones breaking in his body, felt blood filling his mouth, felt consciousness slipping away under the rain of blows. But they did not kill him. The police pushed through the mob and dragged him away before the crowd could tear him to pieces, and he was thrown into a police wagon and driven away to prison, leaving a trail of his own blood on the cobblestones. In the car, someone finally realized that the Archduke and his wife were beyond all help. A doctor who had rushed to the scene checked for pulses and found none. He looked at the wounds and knew immediately that nothing could have saved them, that they had died within minutes of being shot. The bodies were carefully lifted from the blood-soaked car and carried to the governor's residence, where they were laid out on tables in a private room. Someone closed their eyes. Someone cleaned the blood from their faces. Someone sent telegrams to Vienna with the terrible news that would shake the empire to its foundations. And all across Sarajevo the word spread like wildfire. The Archduke is dead, murdered by a Serbian assassin, shot down in the street like a dog. The city that had been celebrating just hours ago was now silent with shock and fear, everyone understanding that something enormous had just happened, that the world had just changed in ways that no one could fully comprehend yet. The news traveled by telegraph wires from Sarajevo to Vienna, from Vienna to Berlin, from Berlin to Paris and London and St. Petersburg, clicking across the continents in code that spelled out doom. In the imperial palace in Vienna, Emperor Franz Joseph received the news about his nephew's death. The old emperor was 83 years old and had already buried his wife, his son, and his brother. Now he was burying his nephew and heir, the man who was supposed to take over the empire when Franz Joseph finally died. The emperor's face showed no emotion as he read the telegram, but inside, his heart was filling with a cold rage that would soon burn across all of Europe. "It is the hand of God," he said quietly to his advisors, but he did not mean it as acceptance. He meant it as justification for what was about to come, for the revenge that would be demanded, for the war that was already being planned in the minds of generals and politicians. And what about the children, the 3 children that Franz Ferdinand had begged Sophie to stay alive for? Their names were Princess Sophie, Prince Maximilian, and Prince Ernst, and they were orphaned in a single morning, losing both parents at the same time to an assassin's bullets. The Austro-Hungarian court treated them terribly after their parents' deaths, taking away their inheritance and titles because their mother had not been considered noble enough for an archduke to marry. They lived through the war as children, watching their entire world collapse around them, watching the empire their father was supposed to rule crumble into dust. They carried the weight of their parents' violent deaths for the rest of their lives, forever marked as the children of the Archduke whose murder started the Great War. The tragedy of June 28, 1914, destroyed not just 2 lives, but countless lives, rippling outward through time like waves from a stone thrown into a pond, touching people who were not even born yet when those 2 shots rang out in Sarajevo. The morning of June 28, 1914, had begun so peacefully, so beautifully, so full of promise. The birds had sung their songs. The sun had painted the sky in gold and pink. The flowers had bloomed in gardens throughout the city. And by noon 2 people were dead, and the fuse had been lit on a bomb that would explode into the deadliest conflict humanity had ever seen. It is one of history's most terrible ironies that something so enormous, so catastrophic, so world-changing could begin with something so small. One wrong turn, one moment of bad luck, one young man with a pistol standing in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. If the driver had not taken that wrong turn, if the car had not stopped to reverse, if Princip had given up and gone home 5 minutes earlier, then Franz Ferdinand would have lived. The ultimatum would not have been set. The war might not have started, or might have started differently, or might have been avoided entirely. Millions of people who died might have lived full lives, had children, grown old peacefully. But history does not work with what-ifs. History only works with what actually happened, and what actually happened that day in Sarajevo was that 2 bullets broke an empire and remade the entire world forever.